Welcome back to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and what it takes to cultivate a healthy mind, body, and spirit. I'm Dr. Steve Thayer, and today my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison, and I discuss attachment styles, and especially how psychedelic therapy might be used to address issues related to attachment wounding. We had a good time with this episode. I think it's an important message. For those of you who are interested in Numinus's psychedelic education and training programs, we're offering courses called the Molecular Foundations of both ketamine, MDMA, and psilocybin. These courses are open to healthcare professionals and the general public and will explore the effects of psychedelics on the body and the mind, including the therapeutic effects of these medicines, the molecular structure of them, and the way they impact the brain. These are self-paced courses that you can just do online at your own pace, hence the term self-paced. You can click on the link in the description or go straight to numinus.com/our-training-selection and use the code PTF10 for 10% off the courses. If you haven't signed up for the MAPS Psychedelic Science Conference yet, happening here pretty soon in June in Denver, it's not too late. Numinus is offering an exclusive 20% discount code to our PTF podcast listeners. Click on the link in the show notes and use the code NWI20 at checkout. If you'd like to support the show, of course, you can always do so by leaving us a rating and review in places like Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can share this episode, perhaps with a partner that you'd like to have discussions about attachment styles with, and we would really appreciate it. Without further ado, here is our episode on attachment. Reid, it's good to be back here with you on the tail end of our 100th episode.
101 today.
Quite a milestone. It was really lovely to get some love. I got a couple of Instagram messages and just messages from friends. Congratulations on the 100th episode. Today, we're going to talk about attachment. We talked a little bit about attachment during our parenting episode, but we thought it might be good to talk about attachment in terms of adult attachment, like how it shows how your attachment style started in childhood, manifests in different relationships as an adult, partner searching, and how you navigate relationships. And then maybe a little bit about how to use psychedelic tools to heal attachment wounds. And then, of course, wherever else the wind takes us.
It's funny that attachment means a couple things when you see it in a title on a podcast like this, or in our field broadly, mental health and psychedelics. It can mean attachment, like non-attachment, letting go of attachments, or attachment theory.
Yeah, we've talked a bit about, like when we talked in our Stoicism episode, or when we've talked about sort of Buddhist philosophy and mindfulness, this notion of being of our attachments being a source of suffering.
Yeah.
And you think about it in terms of relationships, they definitely are that, but again, in terms of relationships, attachment is so fundamental to who we are as these social primates.
Yeah.
Needing connection, needing to feel loved, to feel seen, to feel safe.
And they're essentially getting at the same thing. The fact that we are wired to, as interrelational beings, to interpersonally self-soothe and help each other's soothe. And yeah, we're wired to connect, and those attachments laid down early in life can lead to some suffering if formed in different ways that we'll talk about.
Right. Yeah, wired to connect. I think, especially in the Western world, there recently, the last 50 years or so, there's this bias that humans should be self-sufficient. They should be, like, infants should be left to cry themselves out so that they can learn to self-soothe. This is especially, like, I remember my mom talking about, like, her mom saying when she went to pick up one of us when we were babies, don't pick up that child, you'll spoil him. You'll make him dependent on your love, basically. And given what we know about the importance of attachment, and learning safety in the context of loving, secure, present, non-rejecting attachment, that just seems like the wrong approach.
You can see where it comes from, though, because eventually you have to also let kids figure it out on their own. Like at birth, babies can't take care of themselves, so they need the caregiver. And later in life, there is the risk of overspoiling, and like if your kid sleeps in your bed forever. They will be quite delayed in their development of being able to separate from their primary caregivers in a secure way, right, and survive on their own.
We live in a society where that's necessary. Like if we were living in these tribal societies where we were part of a community forever, the independence, the sort of fly the nest, might be a little less important. But we do live in a society where that independence is necessary to function.
Yeah. What's interesting is babies in mammals or animals in general are often born with a crucial survival skill. Like, what's a baby horse called? A foal? Foals are born able to run. Snakes are born able to bite. Babies are born with their survival skill, which is crying. So it's interesting in the context of asking for help that we've talked about here, that asking for help, even though many of us might consider it a form of a sign of weakness, it's actually a great survival tool. And it's okay to need help sometimes, and we're wired that way, and humans are kind of exist that way.
Yeah. It makes me think of the strange situation test, like the strange situation experiment by Bowlby and Ainsworth.
Yeah.
Where a lot of this attachment research really comes from. This idea being like when mom is removed from the situation, a stranger's present, the securely attached kid is distressed when mom's gone, but when mom comes back, they ask for help, essentially. They return to mom and they get the love that they need. They feel comforted, they feel regulated, and then they can return to independence. They can return to exploring, to playing. So it's not that to raise a kid with a secure to generate a secure attachment, that you have to be constantly present, like you're talking about. You don't have to be a helicopter parent or a bulldozer parent. But when there's separation, the child needs to know that you're the safe home base. That if they come back, if there's repair and rejoining, that there's non-rejecting presence there for them waiting.
Yeah, this is such a fun topic, and I'm feeling all these tangents pulling on me already. Like the fact that ducks, okay, I'm on an animal tangent again. When ducks are born, there's this, they're very imprintable. This concept of imprinting happens right at birth, and they imprint on, attached to the first large object they see. They don't even develop the ability to see the shape and details of an object or see a face until many days into their existence in life. But they will attach or imprint on a basketball if that's the first thing they see. And they do that, like, they're wired that way because they imprint on their mother duck and they follow it from birth. And so there were these, I think it was...
Lorenz?
Yeah, Lorenz in like the 30s, who did research on ducks and how they would follow each other around. And I think there were some funny stories about ducks following him around. Yeah. Or following a basketball around. And Timothy Leary actually liked to cite this research in some of his talks. I was listening to some like speech he gave in the 60s where he said something that stuck with me. I didn't hear it live. I wasn't born. But in re-listening, it struck me because he's like, what are the big orange basketballs that have shown up in your life in a formative time that you were unaware of, that you've attached to?
Yeah, I wonder what those would be. Are they iPads? YouTube for kids?
Yeah, and I think his point is just that we develop these attachments or our attachment style early in life, like in the bosom of the family, and it's beneath the level of our conscious awareness. But then we show up in relationship because we are interrelational beings. We show up in relationship in certain ways, and sometimes maladaptive. And then they're like, why do I keep freaking out every time my partner looks away from me and think they're, flirting with someone else, and I unleash my rage on them, and it's quite off-putting to them. I can see now, but to be able to trace that back to some attachment wounds is really the first step in the journey.
Yeah, that experience of why do I continue to react a certain way? Why do I continue to behave a certain way, repeat certain patterns that sort of bewilder the conscious mind? we find that, the origin story of those patterns usually are a result of attachment failures or woundings that get baked into our nervous system. Because our nervous system is like those lower brain structures, it's pre-conscious. So it might bewilder our conscious mind. Especially lately, it's making me think of the importance of healing wounds in the context in which they were made. So, attachment wounds need to be healed in the context of a relationship. So perhaps you take one of these attachment quizzes and you show up as avoidant or insecure or whatever. But if you're with somebody who is securely attached and they can sort of provide a reparative experience, you might show up in that relationship very differently. And you and I were talking earlier, like we've taken those quizzes, but both you and I sort of fall more into the secure attachment camp with maybe some anxious tendencies. And depending on the partnership that we're in, the relationship that we're in, it can bring forth, again, even though we're securely attached, it can bring forth some of those anxious attachment features where we feel a little bit less safe.
Those are good points, multiple that I just want to highlight. One is that we're wounded in relationship, we heal in relationship. It is an opportunity. Two, triggers our friends to follow. Mm-hmm. Like relationships give us a chance to do that work that we wouldn't otherwise. If you're a hermit in the woods in complete isolation, you don't get to work on this, and you don't have the advantages in survival of being part of a team or tribe, right? So that is, it's a fascinating part of what we do, and I think it's really interesting how it ties into also object relations theory. Like, the concept of object permanence, like, what was it, Piaget, Swiss psychologist back 100 years ago or so, talked about how babies between the age of 1 and 2 would start to realize that when an object is hidden from them, it isn't gone.
Right.
Like, rattle your keys in front of a 1-year-old and then put it behind your back. The 1-year-old will think the keys are gone. Rattle your keys in front of a 2-year-old, put it behind your back, they'll look behind your back.
Right. Yeah, so playing peekaboo with a 1-year-old is different than playing peekaboo with a 2-year-old. Yeah,
and it's it's a fun experiment that I encourage people to go try if you have 1 or 2-year-olds in your life. But I bring it up because it's related to this idea of attachment imprinting and what gets laid down in our nervous system, like you said, baked in, I thought was a good term. Early in life, as mother leaves and you're in your crib alone and you're hungry or you poop your diaper and you cry, if they come back, you're laying down these tracks of trust and this develops over time in a sensory way, not a cognitive way, of course. Babies aren't thinking like we think about these things. And then those persist later in life. So it really matters how you were raised and the primary caregivers you had in terms of how you show up now, even though thankfully we're malleable and can work on it.
I'm glad you said that part, because I know that when I listen to podcasts like this about parenting, I often am like, oh crap, I've screwed up my kids. Kids are pretty resilient and malleable, like you said, and it's never too late to start showing up in this way for people, especially your kids.
And it bugs the hell out of me that in the past there was this idea of refrigerator mother that was emphasized in mental health circles and research, blaming especially mothers for things like autism or schizophrenia that was later disproved. But
schizophrenic mom, I remember.
Yeah, but the thing is, it does require that kind of stance of both responsibility and acceptance of the fact that we are shaped in the bosom of the family, and it does matter, and it's also okay because we're all doing the best we can along the way, and we all are on this journey somewhere. And I just think it's beautiful that you can work on these things, whether you're 5 years old or 50 years old.
Yeah, the buck doesn't stop with the parents, even when you're a kid. Like, if you don't have a healthy attachment environment in the bosom of the family, it's possible to have healthy attachment experiences with other adults when you're younger.
Yeah.
Again, it speaks to the value of having a community or a tribe, whatever word you want to use, a tight-knit community where a kid can turn other places and get some of that.
Yeah, and it also speaks to this idea that we love to talk about on here of corrective experiences that really comes from the 40s. Like, who was it? Alexander and French, talking about how, yes, we're prediction machines. We're wired to predict if someone will be there or not, and we develop our nervous system accordingly. Will they meet our needs or not? But because of neuroplasticity and the malleability that we have, even if you have that at age 50, when you walk into a therapist's office and your system is predicting that if you say something negative, they will reject you and kick you out, and then they don't, there's a point in the corrective experience bucket. It might take many of those, but and especially in a psychedelic state, those things can really make a lasting impression and transformative impression on us as they occur.
Yeah, especially in a psychedelic state. We've talked a bit about Gould Dolan's research and social learning periods being reopened, these windows on psychedelics. It makes sense that if you're working on attachment wounds in psychedelic therapy, that if this sort of critical period's been reopened and you can have a corrective emotional experience in that milieu, then it could be really powerful at repatterning that stuff at the level of the nervous system. It kind of, random aside, it makes me think of those Romanian orphanages where you have kids with failure to thrive.
Yeah.
And even if they were given food and sort of the basic needs to stay alive, if they weren't held, if they weren't like physical contact for sure, but if they weren't responded to, some of them just didn't even make it. And a lot of those kids were adopted later and had really hard times repairing. Yeah,
and the closest, even though we're wary of diagnoses and things and see how they can be helpful for conversations like this, to an extent, to talk about things, there's this condition called reactive attachment disorder that reflects what can happen in super disorganized attachment upbringings and traumatic complex trauma in childhood, where you develop this belief that you're not worthy of love and no one will be there, so you're going to sabotage it before they even have a chance to try and correct it, like when you're adopted by a new family, for example.
Yeah. An understanding of these attachment styles can really help you understand the behavior of a partner. Like if you're in a dating relationship and their behavior seems really bewildering, especially if it's this disorganized type where they're both desperate for your love and attention, but also rejecting of it because they don't trust it. But if you can understand it as a wounding, then you might be able to handle it a little bit better and provide those corrective experiences for a partner. This isn't to say that you should stay in relationships that are unhealthy with somebody who, that the two of you aren't well matched, but.
Yeah, but it brings up an important point, and I would say that it's almost guaranteed that your attachment style will show up and spill out in interesting, perhaps surprising ways to you and your partner, and the more you can talk about that, the better. Like if you each take an attachment quiz on your own and talk to others, close family members, even past relationships, to make sure you're looking at yourself clearly. And then after you've taken an inventory, if you bring it back to each other from a stance of like just listening, like let's get to know your world, like what makes you tick, what makes you who you are, and let's do that for me. And then you can decide together as a team how to navigate it.
It's a great exercise. I highly recommend it. Just Google attachment quiz. There are plenty of them, and do some homework, folks. Bring it to your partner and talk about it.
Yeah, it's really fun to do, and maybe we can talk about examples of that. Well, like we could talk about the main attachment styles and what each of them might look like in a few situations.
So I've got a fun way of describing it. I talked about this in Module 2 of our Fundamentals of Psychedelic-Assisted Therapy course that's going on right now. Check those out at Numinus.com. Cool. But I found this table that has 4 quadrants, and on sort of the x-axis, it goes from low anxiety to high anxiety, and then the y-axis from low avoidance to high avoidance.
Mm-hmm.
So in the upper left-hand quadrant, we have secure attachment. And the way that this particular person describes them in terms of positive or negative thoughts about self and positive or negative thoughts about others. So secure attachment is, I've got some positive thoughts and beliefs about myself, and trust and positive thoughts and beliefs about others. So I've got maybe a high self-esteem. I'm able to set appropriate boundaries. I'm accepting. I'm able to be vulnerable. So as an adult, this is somebody who's empathic and responsive and engaged, responsible. They feel like they're worthy of love and they're capable of getting love and support when they ask for it. Others are willing and able to love me. So an example of, I'm just going to riff on this, and then if you have anything to add or change, go ahead. So the ambivalent or anxious, preoccupied attachment style, this is, I have negative thoughts about myself, but positive hopes about others, so which is why I'm so preoccupied with their behavior. And so I might have a low self-esteem, and I'm really overly concerned about their thoughts. So I'm constantly texting just to feel reassured if I have a suspicion that there's been some kind of breach.
You can't imagine surviving without them,
right?
In some ways, like you really fear losing them and act out of that fear of abandonment or loss sometimes.
Yeah. And it might show up as reassurance seeking, and your partner might feel like you are just a sieve, that they can give you all the love and attention in the world and it just doesn't stick.
Mm-hmm. And maybe an example, like if you are at a party with your partner and they're having a conversation with someone, you think they're being flirtatious. Like an anxious attachment style would then probably go up to them and confront them and like call them out or criticize it, or versus a secure attachment style would take it in stride and trust that they're yours. And an avoidant attachment style would probably just be cold to them and not say anything.
Right. So avoidant is this positive thoughts about self. This is, again, just one way to conceptualize it.
I don't need them.
Right.
Yeah.
But negative thoughts about others, which is why you'll avoid, you'll distance yourself. You sort of try to punish them in this retreating kind of stonewalling type of way.
Yeah. And in a new relationship situation, say you're dating a new romantic interest, the anxious attachment style might be planning the wedding and like texting all the time and daydreaming about them 24/7. The avoidant might be like, put on the brakes, or like, and then the secure would just kind of let it unfold.
Yeah. And you'd think that people who are anxious would want to be in relationships with people who are securely attached, but you often find that people who are anxious end up in relationships with people who are avoidant. It's almost like they create the situations that they're afraid of. Yeah.
And part of that can be related to this imprinting concept too. At least that's some of the work that's done in animals. Even the duck research points to that, of like, sexual preference partnership develops in similar ways as we imprint on like these early formative caregivers. But in another way, we're often seeking out people who are complementary puzzle pieces to our psychopathologies.
Yeah. It's a really helpful way of explaining, again, these sort of bizarre phenomenon. It's bizarre to our rational minds. Like, hey, why does my buddy keep ending up with the same girls, the same women over and over and over again? Like, everybody knows what's going to happen. These people aren't good for him. And it, kind of the old Freudian idea of you marry your mother, you marry your father, or someone with mommy issues or daddy issues is another take on this phenomenon.
Yeah. So anxious and avoidant attachment styles are probably the most common ones besides secure that are talked about. The other main one from Bowlby and Ainsworth would be disorganized, less common, and that would be, like we were talking about in some of those really difficult situations early in life with unpredictable caregiving and where it might show up in a self-sabotaging way before anyone can get close even. But I think, it's probably helpful that we're focusing on the examples in the anxious and avoidant mostly, and we're all moving towards a secure attachment style. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, in terms of this particular conceptualization, the disorganized or the fearful attachment style is negative thoughts about self and negative thoughts about others. You just feel totally lost and afraid.
Yeah, I like that.
Ruminating, you're expecting to be hurt.
I don't like it, but I like that description.
It's a good way of thinking about it. This notion that I'm not worthy of love, I'm not capable of getting love, even when I reach out for it. Others are unable to meet my needs or unwilling to meet my needs. They're abusive. I deserve it.
Yeah. Yeah, so in the context of those styles then, if you ask yourself the question of, what does the ideal relationship provide for you? If you think of that as a team, that's probably more of a secure one. You're each playing to your strengths. If you think of it like, I need them to feel safe, that's probably more in the anxious. And if you think of it like someone who's there, but don't ask me for too much, or, I'm not going to lean on you because I got myself. That's more the avoidant.
And you can imagine the early childhood environments that might produce these attachment styles.
Yeah. And it's, in light of that, like object permanency in childhood develops, say by age 2, usually initially, but then there's this whole journey towards more of a constancy, and this applies to your caregivers. Your mothers are often talked about the most, understandably, both because of culture, had more gender roles in the past when a lot of this research was done, but also because of mothers actually carrying the child and being the only ones who can breastfeed when someone is breastfed. Back then, they used to, what was a saying? They'd say, breast parents are the best parents. It's a silly term, but it shows the added time connecting and interpersonally wiring from mother to child that happens. And it's not always the case, and it doesn't have to matter on gender, but in a traditional kind of, or in a relationship where a kid does spend more time with the mother and does breastfeed, for some time, that does play out, and they attach in certain ways more to their mother, and that's where a lot of the research is focused. Yeah.
It kind of makes sense. This, as a baby, like you were describing, they just have a few things that they're aware of. They need to be fed, they need to be safe, they need to be comfortable. So when you can be held by a being that provides all those things, sustenance and safety and connection, that there would be a pretty powerful bond there. Yeah.
So this constancy that develops over time, it's examples later beyond being a baby would be like knowing that if your parent gets upset at you, as a toddler initially, that might elicit a reaction of like, oh no, it's the end of the world. They hate me. I'm not lovable. They're gone. But then when the parent comes back and loves you anyway, like say you've done something bad, you try to run out in the street and they yell at you. It's really common for kids to put that on themselves, like right. I'm a bad, unlovable kid. But that's part of the process of developing secure attachments, for them to say that so that you can receive it with love. Or another example would be like, it's pretty common for a kid at a certain age, say 3, 4, 5, to not tell the truth about something. Like they get in the cookie jar, they eat 10 cookies, they have crumbs all over their face, they go to their parent, and the parent says, did you get in the cookie jar? They're often smiling as they say this, and the kid is like, no, because they're wired to need survival, need their parent to survive, and they think they did something bad. They're testing if they're going to leave. Like, do I get kicked out because I ate 10 cookies? Even though we're often thinking as kids, that, or as parents of that kid, we're thinking of focusing on the lying. Yeah. But really, it's them testing the secureness of the relationship. And that's why, if you can say to a kid, it's okay, I like cookies too. And, I did that as a kid, and I got a tummy ache and I threw up, and then you're setting limits with love, and that takes a lot of time as well.
Yeah, great examples. I may have shared this on the podcast before, but it reminds me of both simultaneously one of my parenting fails and my parenting wins. I had overreacted to something my kid did, raised my voice. He goes up to his room crying. He's in there with his brother. I calm down. I'm like, okay, I got to go apologize. So I'm walking up the stairs, and I hear through the door, his older brother consoling him, saying, "Don't worry, Dad's coming in here to apologize." And I was like, okay.
Predictability leads to that constancy and secure attachment. And it's a beautiful example, because it's not only not bad that you got mad, it's actually good because you got mad and showed them that you love them anyway. And the flip side of that occurs in kids too. When they get mad, they worry that they're bad and they will be rejected and thrown out and then they can't survive. But if you can then show up as a parent and love them beyond their temper tantrum, then and after it, then you're laying down the tracks of secure attachment that way. So it takes the pressure off parents to behave perfectly in the moment. All we have to do is remember to keep showing up with love over time.
It makes me think of our earlier conversation about spoiling kids. And I wonder if this sort of runs contrary to the notions of just sort of conditioning of treating kids like little robots, and that, if every time they cry, you show up with all this love, is that going to reinforce the crying? Are they going to become too dependent? But I think I like the attachment conversation that we're having here.
Yeah. And
certainly you show up with love, and like you said, loving boundaries. You help the kid regulate, and then especially if they've reacted in a way that we might categorize it as misbehavior. They got angry and they hit their sibling, or they broke something. You don't want them to feel rejected, but you want them to understand that the behavior, that what they engaged in, was not the most appropriate way to handle the emotion. So it's an emotion coaching opportunity. Instead of this kid needs to be disciplined, they need to be trained.
Yeah, and so it speaks to that concept that we've discussed many times here as well, of first validate and then reassure that they're still lovable. They're still there. You're not going anywhere. But you can understand, like, we get upset sometimes, and then when it's appropriate in that conversation, you can say, and you cannot hit your brother. Right. Yeah. So, and next, and that's why I reach out and grab your arm when you're about to smack them, but I still love you.
I've had a tangential thought in my mind that keeps coming up. And it's this idea of legacy attachment burdens that we inherit. And it might be inherited in the sense that it's just, parents repeating what was done to them, and that's passed on through generations. But there's this interesting idea of epigenetics, that like maybe my great-grandfather developed a certain attachment style, and that altered his genetic code that he then passes down, and that I'm in some ways affected or a result of those epigenetic changes. But it also gives hope that, like, the buck can stop, to use that metaphor again, with you. You can make changes to this lineage that will then echo with your posterity.
Yeah, and as someone who's spent a lot of time in genetics labs too, I like to lean more on, I love the concept of legacy burdens and legacy gifts too that we inherit, and I have a sense, or I feel like most of them come from the patterning and conditioning we get in childhood and in utero to a certain extent. And there are chemical influences, there are genetic influence, epigenetic influences too. But an example might be when a kid's crying, like you were saying, and if our reaction is, oh, don't cry, here's an ice cream cone, because our parents did that to us, or because society patterns us, then you're wiring someone to seek food as their comfort or numbing solution to pain, and you might develop an attachment to binging, for example, or seeking food as your comfort.
Right.
But then as we shine a light of awareness on that, we can start to say, wait a second, that's not the only way to be, and that's not serving me well. going to try on a new one with me and with my kids. Yeah.
Maybe we can talk a bit more about using psychedelic tools and how psychedelic-assisted therapy might help with attachment wounding.
Yeah.
We talked a bit about the Dolan's research and the opening of those sort of social critical periods, those social learning critical periods. But, especially when we look at the research done on MDMA-assisted therapy, MDMA in particular does some really interesting things in the nervous system and in the brain that allow for that fear response to be reduced, calms down that amygdala, the fight or flight response, so that a person who has avoidant or anxious attachment might then open themselves up to an experience that is repatterning for them. And it's interesting to see that all the MDMA research done by MAPS is done with therapy dyads. Mm-hmm. Not all the psychedelic research is doing this, but most of them do. And then often these dyads are male-female dyads, which is, arguable if it's necessary, but interesting, given that every human being came onto the planet as a result of, a male and a female hooking up, right?
Yeah.
That it's a great opportunity with that fear response reduced for transference onto the therapy dyad in a really positive way for a reparenting experience.
It's like the imprinting concept we were talking about. In fact, Timothy Leary used to talk about it. He said, psychedelics temporarily suspend your previous imprints and open up a new window for you to form new ones.
Yeah.
And he was a psychologist and informed in attachment theories and object relations theories. And I know that Timothy Leary has mixed reviews out there, but I like to talk about it so we can evaluate it and learn from both his wise thoughts and his foolish ones too. But I do think he was onto something there of psychedelics opening up, like Dolan is showing in her research, this reopening this window of being able to reshape things like our attachments.
Mm-hmm. It also makes me think of psychedelic healing in the group context. So ayahuasca ceremonies with large groups, or there's other psychedelic healing modalities that happen in the context of groups, and how powerful it is to be super vulnerable with more than just the clinicians working with you, but the other people in the room witnessing it, and just with nothing but respect and security and safety, and how much more healing that can be when it's not just the two people working on you, it's this group that you're with.
Yeah, I'm doing a ketamine group right now with Hannah in this room. Actually, we don't dose ketamine in this room, it's down the hall, but there's a group of 6 people, and it has been absolutely amazing to witness that happening. The compassion that others show, that the group shows to each other, and the corrective experiences that come as someone talks about an old attachment wound or their past traumas, and how just by nature of having this cohesive group and some psychedelic experiences together, people are letting go of some of those negative, fearful assumptions about the world that are applied universally and prevent them from re-engaging with the world, because they can have those little wins with each other.
Right. Yeah, the groups are so powerful for that reason. Psychedelics are not. A lot of my dissertation research was on a questionnaire of the quality of the therapeutic relationship in group therapy. And there were different factors and facets. One of them was, the positive bonding working alliance relationship between the group members and the group facilitator or the therapist, but also that relationship with other group members, and then to the gestalt of the group as a whole. And those other 2 variables that aren't present in just one-on-one therapy made for a unique kind of power that can be harnessed in a group. And I'd be running therapy groups, and I'd have group members support each other in ways that I would never even have thought of, also in ways that I wouldn't be capable of. Because as the group facilitator, I stand apart a bit from the group.
Yeah.
So sometimes feedback and acceptance that comes from a group member can be more powerful than the feedback and acceptance that comes from the guy you're paying to lead the group, right? And to hold you with safety, like, oh, this guy doesn't owe me anything over here, and he's accepting me anyway. It's super powerful.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's one of my favorite things to do is psychedelic group work. I mean, we've done plenty of that together too, and even a retreat in Jamaica earlier this year with a big group. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a cool experience because we really got to see what we're describing here. Other members of the group showing up for each other when we couldn't be everywhere at once, helping everybody through their process. Also trusting people to process themselves. But again, like we're talking about, this healing by belonging and connecting is so cool.
Yeah, that's amazing. You get to let go what the psychology literature would call the causal misattributions of childhood, or those wounds in relationship that we take as literal eternal truths and apply it to our predictions of everyone. Yeah.
And it can take repetition, right? Like we were talking a bit before we hit record about, there are things that we can heal or grow with respect to at the level of the mind. And then we'll often be surprised when it comes back to us in response to a particular trigger. And we're like, man, I thought I worked on that. I thought I was good. I thought I fixed that. But because of the nature of this type of wounding, that it happens early on when things are being, our nervous system is developing, that it embeds itself at that level. And so it's going to need to be healed at that level, which is why I think psychedelic tools are so powerful, because they put us back into our bodies, depending on the medicine. You hear MDMA sometimes referred to as a heart opener. So below the level of of conscious thought of the mind into the level of the nervous system and the emotions. Yeah,
this work is a multi-layered sensory process, not really a cognitive one. Mm-hmm. Just like, when you're a baby and you're crying for your mother, whether you need food or a diaper change or just comfort and soothing, and then like parent comes in, mother or father sings a lullaby. There's a reason why like people sing to their kids too, and imprint on their faces, their voices. And it's really neat to see how that can happen again later in life, both in relationship, in groups, in therapeutic situations as well. Mm-hmm. And shamans sometimes are singing like Lakota lullabies to you while you're in a vulnerable ayahuasca state, for example. Maybe there's something there. Yeah. I was in one of those states once, and the space that was being held for me it felt like I was a baby. And the way that the facilitators were talking to me was basically baby talk. And my mind had no idea what was going on. My mind was sort of keeping track, and it was like, this seems weird. But my body was totally responding to it, just relaxing in a way that I didn't even know I had tension there, and it was relaxing. And from a parts work perspective too, psychedelics put you in a vulnerable state. And some people even show up in that state that might look like you're regressing to a certain age. You're scared, or scared like you would have been at age 5 or something like that. And you're almost, from an IFS, internal family systems perspective, you're blended with that part, that 5-year-old self. And therefore, you may not at the time have full like cognitive access to all your other parts. You're really having this full sensory experience of vulnerability. But that also means there's access to that part that wasn't otherwise there because of our cognitive walls. And if the therapy, the guiding, the experience is done right, it can really be corrective. But it also speaks to the need to make sure you're in a good, safe situation when you go into psychedelic journeys, because there is that openness, and there is the risk of kind of bad imprinting.
Yeah, the very same reasons for which, the same reasons a psychedelic healing context is powerful are the same reasons that it can be dangerous.
Yeah.
I think I hear you saying, like, you need to be really discerning to the extent that that is possible about who you are with, if you're in a group setting, or the facilitator that you're with, the therapist that you're with, because you're made so vulnerable, you can be hurt in a deep way.
Yeah, whether those are emotional wounds or otherwise.
Well, Reid, anything else with respect to attachment, using psychedelic tools to address attachment wounds that we think might be useful?
Well, let's see. We talked about asking for help. We talked about how this develops in kids, how it shows up in relationship, how it shows up in therapy. But trying to think of any other bases we haven't covered on this. What do you have from your end?
Well, you mentioned therapy, and certainly the name of our podcast is Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, but I think one of the cool things about therapy in general is that it is a great context within which to explore attachment wounds. Because you have this person who's 100%, they're doing it well, here for you, that's aware of their own stuff, such that they're not allowing it to get in the way of your process. And when therapy goes well, at least when it goes well with my clients, they've learned to trust me enough to be vulnerable, to open up so that I can provide for them to the extent that I can, a corrective emotional experience where they feel seen, they feel validated, they feel accepted, there's no rejection there, so that they can kind of relax into self-acceptance and maybe start trusting that other people could give that to them. And like you said, they can ask for help and receive it.
And I think it's important to point out that while therapy, coaching, whatever it is, good therapy and coaching can be so helpful in that session, it's only like an hour or two a week, right? And what really matters, where the rubber really meets the road, is how you practice it in day-to-day life. And so I think it's just important to remember trying this on in our relationships. We're wounded in relationships. We heal and grow in relationship. So taking that and trying on the asking for help, talking about it with the important people in your life, and knowing that it is completely okay to need help. It is okay to have these secure, anxious attachment style features, or even disorganized ones, and that the way to work on it is by looking at those in ourselves and sharing them with others, and exploring it, because we're here to love each other and show up for each other.
Yeah. You could say that it's okay to be dependent on one another.
We all are, in fact.
We are, right? Not only is it okay, it is in our nature. We do need each other.
Yeah.
So great way to wrap up. Go take an attachment quiz and talk about the results with your partners.
Okay, Steve, I will.
Thanks, Reid.
Take care.
Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus, a mental wellness company committed to tackling the global mental health crisis by delivering best-in-class psychedelic-assisted therapies, contributing to the body of primary and clinical psychedelic research, and fostering healing through community connection and social responsibility. You can learn more about Numinus at numinus.com. That's Numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. Rate and review the show on platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Subscribe to the Numinus YouTube channel, like the videos, and share it. Share the show or clips of the show with someone that you think will enjoy it. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.